now, over 67% of South Africa's total population reside in South African cities. Now, access to jobs and services is one of the biggest drivers of relocation. So, how are the country's cities faring? The South African Cities Network has released its 2021 State of the Cities report. Let's get more info now on what some of that report says to us, in particular about life expectancy. Let's talk to the program's manager for well-governed cities. That's Danga Mughogho, who speaks to us from the city of Johannesburg. Mr. Mughogho, thank you very much for your time. Let's start with the compilation of this report. Why is it compiled? But second of all, how often is it published?
Thank you for that question. The State of South African Cities report is our flagship research product at the South African Cities Network, which has existed since 2002 as a think tank, if you will, for the mayors of the major metropolitan municipalities. But I realized that they faced particular challenges by the scale and the size of the metros, that they needed some people to research into and to provide answers and policy suggestions as to how our metropolitan municipalities, where, as you indicated at the beginning of your report, where the majority of the population actually lives.
Yeah.
So and every 5 years in parallel with the local government election administration. So this report is dated for 2021 and looks back on the previous 5 years across a range of dimensions. So those dimensions are inclusion, which is how inclusive are our cities? Do we include women, vulnerable people, migrants, people with disabilities in city outcomes? Also, secondly, looking at productivity, as you mentioned also in your opening remarks. How productive are cities and do they provide opportunities, economic opportunities for their residents?
Yeah.
And then look at well-governed cities, which is my area. So whether cities are financially sustainable, and then do they have the systems and processes in place to actually achieve the developmental outcomes of our urban policy goals?
All right. So you've given us the scope of why this report is compiled, and more importantly, those variations as you put them. Let's get to more interesting questions, less technical. If my family and myself want to live longer, in which city do I need to be living in right now, and why is that city the favored one?
Oh my goodness, this is a trick question, I see. Well, I think I would, that kind of a question, you can't really answer it necessarily, and our report is definitely not geared towards answering that question. What we can say more broadly is just to say that within our cities, opportunities are, of course, greater than they would be in other parts of the country. So, for example, rural areas and perhaps some peri-urban areas, which is why people move to cities. That, though, the dimension that we focus on in terms of inclusion is an important predictor, if you will, of people's outcomes. So, for example, if someone arrives at a city and is not able to if we don't have an economy that offers them the opportunity to make a livelihood, then it's likely that their life expectancy, looked at over a long period of time, might be lesser because, of course, you need a job to have food. And also it's an important aspect of mental health as well.
Yeah.
Livelihoods. So I think within our subset of cities, which are the metropolitan municipalities, you couldn't really pass out and say which city is better to live in, but merely to say that urban areas continue to be the places where opportunity does exist. And what we need to do as cities and as a country is to ensure that our cities remain inclusive, which allows for everybody to have an opportunity and therefore a longer life.
All right. So I'm going to try and get to that question again, but slightly differently this time. You speak about life expectancy. In your report, or in your compilation of this report, between men and women, who lives longer, and where did you find this evidence of either women or men living longer than the other?
Yes, so I think it's fair to say that the report doesn't focus specifically on life expectancy. I mean, the one thing that it does do, though, is indicate that, and in keeping with statistics across the world, that women in general live longer than men in any case. And reflection of one particular dimension of urban life and indeed life in general, which is around urban safety. And that suggests that typically men are involved in more hazardous pursuits, either at work. We still have disparities in terms of workplace employment between the genders, but also that just by nature of the things that men tend to do and the way they're socialized, that men tend to participate, if you will, in more, they drive faster and various other things. And so there's, insurance tables which can show you, and that is why, for example, you or I will probably be charged a higher premium on car insurance than a woman would be. I think what's important to note, though, also is to say that these varied dimensions of life are really a function of, as I mentioned earlier, the economic opportunities, the livelihoods that exist within a city, but then also a function of, whether we're in fact able to make sure that those cities are livable places, as our the urban integrated urban development framework calls for. So it calls for inclusive cities, it calls for sustainable and resilient cities. And this is another aspect of livelihood that is important, which is we've seen the risks to livelihoods posed by floods in eThekwini. We've seen droughts in some of the other coastal cities like Nelson Mandela Bay and Cape Town. So those factors all come together in a long-term view. As I said, you can't really necessarily, make distinctions between cities over a 5-year period, or indeed over a longer period than that. But we can actually say that there's certain conditions which, if they come together, produce a better life and a longer livelihood for women and everybody living in an urban area.
Danga, you mentioned at the start of this conversation that yours is to look at well-governed cities or the governance of cities. So are you able to give us your top 3 well-governed cities and maybe throw in there the one crucial question, and that is, which is the most violent city in South Africa at the moment?
Those are all very good questions. I think, once again, what we try in our report is not necessarily to point out and point fingers at specific cities, but really look across the group of cities and therefore make generalizations which would apply across those cities. So looking at in terms of governance, the finding that we find across the cities, in fact, is that political stability is key to governance. So if you some of the changes that happened after the local government elections of 2016, in those metros where there was political instability, then that tended to have a knock-on effect on the ability of the administration to perform and deliver the outcomes that we would like to see in urban areas. So, for example, if there's a lot of political infighting, then that in effect means that politicians take their eye off the ball in terms of their very important oversight function, which is whereby the politicians oversee the administration, the people who actually do the work, like put in the infrastructure, deliver the services and so on, to make sure that does in fact happen per electoral promises. And I think it's fairly clear to see that there are certain cities where political instability had a knock-on effect in terms of developmental outcomes. The other question you asked is whether some cities are more violent than others. I think that's also a very nuanced question, and that can only be addressed, and indeed our work, the Urban Safety Report, which was also released a couple of weeks ago, the State of Urban Safety, which is another South African flagship publication, says that there are particular hotspots within all metros where, in fact, rates of violence are greater than they would be in other parts of those metros. So it's not possible to generalize and say one city is more dangerous than another. And we would urge people listening and reviewing our reports not to look at it in that way, but really look across the broad trends that influence those outcomes that we're concerned about. So in the case of safety, what is it that makes a city unsafe for women and girls? Once again, is the city a place that is inclusive? Is the city designed in such ways that it is in fact safe for vulnerable people, women and girls, to move around at different times of the day or night, or going to and from work? So these are some of the broader trends that we really try and look at rather than pinpoint individual differences between cities. We want to be supportive and to make constructive criticism, if you will.
Yeah. Well, let me say this, sir. As we end this conversation, you are very, very, very gifted in giving politically correct answers. You were not able to tell us that city X is better than city Y, which is, I suppose, the most comforting thing for politicians. because those are the people that fight over whether or not they run our cities well. Thank you very much for your time, Danga Mughogho. But I can tell you that the answer that sort of gave away